A blatant propaganda campaign is underway in the Council on Foreign Relations-dominated major media aimed at convincing Americans that Islamic fundamentalism is the new global threat we must prepare to battle. According to the managers of public opinion, the new Muslim threat is not only more sinister than any residual communist menace, but is probably more dangerous than communism ever was. It would, no doubt, strike the uninformed as very odd then to learn that the same Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, operatives in government and the media who are most loudly declaiming against the scourge of militant and fundamentalist Islam are indeed the very strategists who are most responsible for the policies and actions, both past and present, that have built and continue to aid the most fanatical, anti-American, Islamic fundamentalist regimes and organizations in the world today. Odd, that is, unless these regimes and organizations are serving a hidden purpose. Quite obviously, that is the case. Iran, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Algeria, the PLO, the Muslim Brotherhood, and a host of others in the extremist camp, most recently Afghanistan, have been built into menacing perils to, among other things, justify the transformation of the UN's blue helmets into global gendarmes capable of enforcing UN dictates on all peoples and nations. Iran was the first major victim in this scheme. Iran under Shah Reza Pahlavi was the West's strongest ally in the region and the force for moderation, modernization, and advancement of human fights. But to Jimmy Carter and the CFR cabal surrounding him, Iran was to be the starting domino in a chain reaction designed to usher in the New World Order. Khomeini's fundamentalists didn't overthrow the Shah, as the media mythmakers would have you believe. Carter and company did that. While the establishment media cartel smeared the Shah as a latter-day Hitler, the Carter administration pulled every deception and dirty trick imaginable to undermine the Pahlavi rule. UN Ambassador Andrew Young, CFR, added to the media image of Ayatollah Khomeini, then in exile, as a great holy man, declaring that he will be hailed as a saint when he returns to Tehran. In the final act, General Alexander Haig, CFR, sent his deputy commander, General Robert Haweiser, to warn the Iranian military against supporting their emperor. As General Amir Hussain Rabiei, commander of the Iranian Air Force, saw it, Haweiser took the Shah by the tail and threw him out of the country like a dead mouse. Iraqi counterbalance. No sooner was the US-led Iranian coup completed than the CFR brain trust in our foreign policy establishment cited balance of power imperatives to justify pouring hundreds of millions, and then billions, of dollars of aid, technology, and military assistance into Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Saddam, the CFR double domes in the Reagan-Bush administrations assured us, would be our protection against the Khomeini strain of virulent Islam. During the 8-year Iran-Iraq war, Washington sold weapons to both sides, but clearly tilted toward Iraq. In previous articles, this magazine has detailed the decade-long U.S. build-up of Saddam's war machine in spite of his continued mortal hostility toward the U.S., his support for terrorism, and his criminal use of poison gas on his own civilian population. Investigations by the House Banking Committee and journalists have carefully documented a sordid trail of treachery and treasonous actions by George Bush and his retinue before, during, and after the Persian Gulf War. One of the latest and most comprehensive exposés of this whole affair is provided in the new book, Spider's Web, The Secret History of How the White House Illegally Armed Iraq, by Financial Times of London correspondent Alan Friedman, reviewed in the New American, February 21, 1994. The U.S. provided or assisted Iraq in obtaining cluster bombs, technology for nuclear enrichment, U.S.-designed munitions, missile technology, some $5 billion in loan guarantees, and much more. When the shooting started in Desert Storm, Mr. Bush's CFR coterie had us bedding down with Assad of Syria, Saddam's rival for the title of maximum terrorist leader. New Afghan threat. The bombing of the World Trade Center may have signaled the rise of a new terrorist center, Kabul, Afghanistan. The Arab suspects in the case, reportedly tied to Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, received their training during the Afghan war from mujahideen groups trained and supplied by the CIA. The Sheikh has been closely allied with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, leader of one of the most radical elements of the Afghan mujahideen, and the one most favored by U.S. intelligence. We may yet learn that our nation's most spectacular terrorist bombing was brought to us courtesy of the CIA, either indirectly and unintentionally or, perhaps, directly and intentionally. What, our own CIA implicated? Too wild to believe? Not if you're familiar with the company and its Afghan campaign. Carter's ousting of the Shah and installation of Khomeini in February 1979 was the signal that set in motion the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan later that year. The communist occupation of the country and brutal campaign of genocide against the Afghan people were the putative inspirations for the ensuing U.S. government program of aid to the Afghan mujahideen. Strange, then, that year after year, right up to the present, American money, arms, and friendship have been lavished on those radical forces with no popular following among the Afghans, no effective fighting forces, and little or no records of fighting the Soviet enemy, but with long records of treachery and betrayal, and well known for their open hostility toward America. Meanwhile, the most popular warrior groups that were carrying on the valiant fight against the invaders, and that also happened to be the most moderate and pro-Western, received only crumbs. Of the 7 mujahideen parties that made up the Afghan Allied resistance, U.S. aid flowed overwhelmingly to the 3 most virulently anti-Western, anti-American parties: Islamic, Party of Islam, led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar; Islami, Islamic Society, led by Professor Burhanuddin Rabbani and his military commander Ahmad Shah Massoud; and Ittihad Islami, Islamic Unity, led by Professor Abdul Rashid Saif. All of the above had become involved in the radical, pan-Islam, movement of the Ikhwan, Muslim Brotherhood, during the 1960s and '70s at Kabul University. The biggest obstacles to pan-Islam, a movement to unite all of Islam in worldwide solidarity, had always been the tribal, regional, national, sectarian, ethnic, and linguistic diversity and fierce independence of the Islamic peoples. However, there are 2 outside threats to Islamic society that the pan-Islamists have exploited with considerable success to overcome many of these obstacles: 1. Atheistic communism, and 2. Western secularism, materialism, and immorality. What is most disturbing is how time and again the American and Soviet leaders and the CIA and KGB have appeared to be working in tandem to help pan-Islamism by directly aiding and collaborating with the most radical groups against the more moderate factions. The undisputed favorites. The forces of Hekmatyar and Massoud not only received the lion's share of Western aid, as well as assistance from Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, but were, and remain, the undisputed favorites of the U.S. Information Agency, USIA, and the CFR-controlled media. Sibghatullah Mujahidi, a respected Islamic theologian and religious leader who was elected president of the Afghan government in exile by the Mujahideen during the Soviet occupation, and was elected president of the first interim government after the Soviet pullout, tried repeatedly without success to warn U.S. leaders of this folly. Mujahidi complained bitterly that the lopsided support for Hekmatyar was immoral and counterproductive, since Hekmatyar was murdering his Mujahideen allies, collaborating with the communists, and undermining the authority of the Mujahideen government. Independent observers and journalists like Kurt Lobeck, author of the important new book, Holy War, Unholy Victory, Eyewitness to the CIA's Secret War in Afghanistan, also warned repeatedly against the U.S. favoritism toward Hekmatyar and repeatedly were told that the favoritism would end. It didn't. Lobeck records in his book a meeting he had with then-U.S. Ambassador to Pakistan Robert Oakley, CFR, in 1988, at which Oakley assured him that aid to Hekmatyar would cease. 1 year later at a press briefing, Oakley stated categorically that Hekmatyar's aid had been stopped completely. About 1 week later, Lobeck followed a 50-truck convoy of U.S. weapons and supplies from the Peshawar airport to Hekmatyar's camp. After the Red Army pulled out in 1989, the Soviets continued massive support for their surrogate regime under Najibullah and his militia of brigands commanded by General Abdul Rashid Dostum. The U.S. cut off aid to the Mujahideen with the exception of Hekmatyar's group, even though by this time Hekmatyar's double-dealing and assassination of fellow Mujahideen leaders had thoroughly discredited him even among many of his erstwhile admirers in the Western media. Hekmatyar and Massoud have done everything possible since the Soviet departure to undermine unity among the Mujahideen factions and turn Kabul into another Beirut. In 1992, following the fall of the hated Najibullah regime, Massoud, the vaunted Lion of the Panjshir, joined forces with General Dostum's KGB-backed militia to drive his longtime rival, Hekmatyar, from Kabul. Massoud installed his mentor, Burhanuddin Rabbani, as president and himself as Minister of Defense. Now it is Hekmatyar who is allied with Dostum against Massoud. Meanwhile, the more moderate Afghan leaders such as Sibghatullah Mujahidi, Muhammad Mohammadi, Said Gilani, Rahim Wardak, Younus Khalais, Abdul Haq, Abdul Qadir, whose forces actively fought the communists and who represent the best hope for a stable, peaceful, and pro-Western Afghanistan, have been marginalized, unable to compete against the better-equipped Massoud and Hekmatyar factions. During Desert Storm, these Afghan leaders sent a brigade of Mujahideen to fight alongside U.S. troops, while Massoud did nothing and Hekmatyar sided with Saddam Hussein. According to Lobeck, the same KGB officials who were operating in Kabul during the Soviet-installed Karmel and Najibullah regimes are today continuing business as usual under the Rabbani-Massoud administration. Lobeck, the only Western journalist to cover the Afghan war full-time from the front lines from 1983 to 1992, and one of the most knowledgeable outsiders on the internal politics of Afghanistan, told the New American recently that Mahmoud Bialeh, the hardcore communist brother of former dictator Babrak Karmat, is living in a mansion in Kabul and has his own militia and free run of the city, unmolested by Massoud's forces. Which, says Lobeck, is amazing, considering he was a high-ranking member of both his brother's and Najibullah's governments. Concerning Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, Lobeck said, "The first time I saw Sheikh Rahman was at Gulbadin Hekmatyar's headquarters in Peshawar, Pakistan. He has close connections to Gulbadin, as do most of the other radical fundamentalist, Islamic groups from around the world." We asked Lobeck how recent was the most recent CIA aid to Massoud and Hekmatyar. "Probably this morning, would be my educated guess," he replied. "It hasn't stopped."